Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the Friday Lunchbox. I am Tom, and this is Ben, and we are digging into God's Word with you on National Nut Day and National Caps Lock Day, if you care.
Yeah, don't really care. Don't really know why caps lock exists. I think it's usually more of a hindrance than a benefit in my life. What about you?
Yeah, I don't use it unless to express anger, and now with emojis, you got much more. And do I really need to express anger through a text?
I feel like it's easier to hold shift while I type than hit caps lock and then remember to turn it off. Yeah. But you're a hunt and pecker when you type.
I am.
So
like I try to do that,
caps lock
but I'm the fastest two-finger typer I've ever seen. So,
but still slow.
I've not seen a lot. Yeah.
Jeremy, what is your favorite nut?
Maybe a wing nut. Wing nut.
I've heard people call you that before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Not the kind of nut I was envisioning when I asked that
question.
question.
Maybe it's like the nuts that you chew.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I'm a big cashew fan.
Really?
But they're expensive.
Yeah, I like macadamia nuts.
I like pistachios, which are also inexpensive.
Yeah. Elephants.
Shelled or unshelled?
Unshelled.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't eat the shell, but like you can buy them unshelled.
Oh, okay. I buy them shelled because I'm a good steward of my money.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
and you can reuse those for any crafts that you want. Use the shells.
Yeah, I have lots of homemade crafts on my refrigerator.
Pistachio shells.
Pistachio shells, yeah.
I could see that, yeah.
Well, we're excited to jump into God's Word together. We will be finishing the book of 1 Kings, starting 2 Kings, and following along in 2 Chronicles. Same stories, different details. And we'll be in the New Testament this week, starting the Gospel of Matthew. So let's jump in together as we study God's Word.
All right, we're going to start in 1 Kings. We're continuing on. We ended last week. We talked about this kind of grand showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and we kind of come out of that. God has sent rain, and Elijah... things don't really go well after that. He has this mountaintop experience on Mount Carmel, and then Jezebel, who is a huge fan of the prophets of Baal, not a huge fan of Elijah, basically says, "Hey, I'm gonna kill you. Like we're gonna make sure you do not survive this." And so he runs, and he ends up in this wilderness, and he's in a really low spot. God, basically take me now. Like
despairing
I am done.
of life itself. Yeah.
And God's response is one of the most biblical things we can see. Take a nap and eat some food, right? And kind of just hey, you're not you when you're hungry. So we're not sponsored by Snickers yet. But it's this moment where he's just really low. And we go from this big high to this really deep low. What do we learn about that, Ben?
Yeah, I think that the thing that really stood out to me, right, is that, I don't know, it's really easy to let our perspective on life be dictated by our circumstances, right? Like, I think Elijah, he's coming off this experience at Mount Carmel, and he is, expecting, he's just seen God do this incredible thing, and he's kind of expecting things to change in Israel, for there to be revival, for people to turn back to him, for, God finally to, really begin turning hearts towards him. And we see, again, like you said, that doesn't happen. I think when that doesn't happen, when things don't go the way that Elijah expects or wants, we see him sink into like depression, despair, like wanting to die. Like he just saw God like consume, the sacrifice on the mountain by fire, and now here he is just a little bit later despairing of life itself. And so it's easy in our lives, I think, too, to look at our circumstances and let that kind of dictate and determine just our lives and how we live and how we view God and how our relationship with him is affected. But one thing that's really cool about this story is that even at that lowest point, right, that God hears his prayer and God brings comfort to him. He gives him a good nap and gives him some food and kind of pulls him up out of the pit. And so I think, we can see, one, that, we need to be careful not to view God or our lives just through the lens of our circumstances, but two, that we can trust no matter what our circumstance is, that God is with us in it, and that we can cry out to him in our despair, and that he hears us and he answers that prayer.
Yeah, so we have Elijah is in the wilderness when this God kind of takes him out there and basically speaks to him, like, and it's kind of, hey, it's not in the big movement, it's not in the wind, it's not in the fire. It's God speaks to him in this small whisper, and then he basically says, hey, this is what you're going to do now. Go and anoint these kings, and he anoints a king of Syria, which again outside of the Jews, and kind of just a push forward to God's going to include everyone one day, and then we kind of get into. He finds another guy named Elisha, and God says, hey, call him. And what do we see in this story as we kind of look at, okay, the passing of the baton, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We see a lot here where we meet Elisha first. It's, by the way, we're probably going to mix these names up, but Elijah, who was the prophet, and Elisha, who's going to become the prophet. Next, and you just see, like we were talking about this, the passing of the mantle, which is kind of a slang term we use that comes from this story where Elijah is passing on kind of this role as the prophet of Israel to Elisha, and it's even a little reminiscent of like the New Testament when Jesus calls his disciples, right, where Jesus walks past them on, as they're fishing on the shore and says, hey, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Right here we see Elijah walking past Elisha, throwing a coat on him and saying, he doesn't say follow me, but essentially that's what he's saying, like, hey, like, here's my mantle, here's my cloak, I want you to come and follow me. And we see, again, reminiscent kind of the New Testament where Elisha immediately, it says he basically stops what he's doing. He makes a sacrifice to God, and he leaves everything behind and follows Elijah. And so that's kind of an interesting parallel we see. What are anything else that stood out to you as we kind of see that transition from Elijah to Elisha?
Yeah, I think, and we'll talk about this here a little bit as we get into 2 Kings, but there is that, like, following him, like that picture of, like, following this teacher that we see when Jesus says to his disciples, come and follow me. It says, hey, come and walk in my footsteps and learn from me. And he does that, but in order to do that, right, this, like, sacrifice that he makes is what brings him his livelihood. He has these oxen, that's how he plows his field. It's hard to do it by hand, right? And so when he sacrifices them, he's basically saying, I am not this person anymore. I am a new person in who God has called me to be.
Yeah,
so,
and we do see, you read through a few chapters here, and pretty soon we'll see Elijah leaves. Mm-hmm. But the reality is when you kind of break it down, like, there is a significant period of time here where Elisha is just following him and watching him, much like the disciples did with Jesus. And while that's all going on, we kind of see what's happening in Israel with Ahab and Jezebel, who are the evil and wicked king and queen of the northern tribes. We kind of see Ahab's downfall, where he goes to battle, God gives him victory, and rather than, destroying this nation that is opposing them, he makes a treaty with them instead. He disobeys God, right? And then in chapter 21, we see, again, this story with this guy named Naboth, who has a vineyard close to Ahab, and Ahab wants that vineyard, and Naboth says, no, this is my inheritance. I'm not going to give it up. It's my family's. And so Jezebel creates a situation where she basically gets people to falsely accuse this man, and he's stoned and murdered. Kind of reminds me of like David with Uriah, creating the situation that he would get murdered. So we see Ahab and his wife doing terrible things, disobeying God in battle, murdering this innocent man, and then even ignoring God's prophets. We see they go to battle later against the advice of one of God's prophets who says, hey, God's not with you in this, don't go.
Yeah.
And he says, well, I don't really like your advice. I don't like what you're saying, so I'm going to go anyway. And we see all of these decisions lead to his downfall and his eventual death. And we see, again, that Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel, are not in a good place. And God has placed Elijah and soon to be Elisha in the midst of this evil, generation, this evil kingdom as it is right now, to continue to speak truth and to warn them and to call them back to God during this kind of tumultuous and not very good time in their history.
Yeah, so that kind of wraps up First Kings and leads into Second Kings in terms of this really focuses on that passing of that, the mantle, passing of that, the baton. And we talked about that a little bit of this. You have like Elijah, like the first one is basically saying, "Hey, stay here. I'm going to go do these things." And he's like, and then Elisha's like, "No, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to go. I'm going to go." And this, I'm going to walk in your footsteps. And he's wanting this like portion of his like spirit that he like calls it. Basically, he wants like God's favor on him and God to use him. And so he's saying, I'm going to go and do this however I want. And when he tries to do it in his like power, it doesn't work, right? And then, but then you finally see, it's one of the weirdest things in the Bible to me where it's basically like, hey, you've asked for this portion. It's kind of a hard thing to do. So if you see when I'm taken up, then you're going to get it. If not, you're not going to get it. And it's kind of like, what in the world? Like, but you have like Elijah is taken up to heaven, right? He doesn't die. Like, what do we?
One of the few, two. There's I think another guy in Genesis, right? Enoch.
Yes, it's a select group.
Yes, a very small group, right? Who, from what we read here, right, Elijah does not ever die, but God comes and takes him up in a chariot of fire up into heaven, and Elisha does see him, and so it seems that he's even given this double portion of God's Spirit that rests on him, and then we see very quickly, right, after Elijah's gone, now it's just Elisha. He's had that period of learning, of following, and now he is God's prophet to Israel. And we see kind of the validation of that reality in the next chapters where he performs several different miracles. We see, I think what's the first thing he does? He parts the Jordan River, right? Elijah did it by striking the water with his cloak or his mantle, but Elisha, it says, just does it by touching the water himself, so that there's, again, some sense where he's got even God's Spirit is on him, if you will, in an even greater way. And then we see just this series of miracles really starting in chapter 2 all the way through chapter 6. And we're just going to highlight a few of them. I mean, we see the widow's oils multiplied. We see the Shunammite woman, we see that she's given the ability to have a son even though her husband's old. We see that son who's born eventually dies and is raised back to life. We see the deadly stew that Elisha makes.
So a great nickname.
Yeah, the bread that's multiplied. We see Naaman's. So we see all these miracles. And again, it's kind of reminiscent of Jesus in a way. Even some of the miracles themselves, right? Like the bread multiplying. I mean, sound familiar?
He did that, yeah.
Right? I think Jesus might have done that too. And so you see God's power is clearly with Elisha, and he's performing all of these miracles both inside Israel, outside Israel. And it's clear that, hey, the mantle, again, no pun intended, has been passed to him. But rather than try to cover all these miracles, we thought, let's just hit on a couple as we kind of wrap up our time in the Old Testament today. So what's a couple of them that really stood out to you?
Yeah, so we have the widow's oil, right? This whole, like, it's very similar to a story that we saw with Elijah, where you have the woman who, hey, I'm on my last bit of flour and oil, and makes this cake. We have a similar story here of like, hey, she is running out, and she's like saying, hey, what am I to do? And he says, hey, gather every like pot that you can, and just trust, right? Have a faith that this will happen. And so she goes and she goes to her neighbors and gathers these pots, and like they're filled. Everyone that she has is filled. Like she has exactly enough for how much faith she has, if you will. And so again, we need to be like careful in that in terms of like, it's not like, well, if you just have faith, God will do what you want. But there is a portion that is, hey, we have to have faith, and God will pour out what he wants to do, and it's up to us to have faith in what he could do. And so we see that in this like story. And then what stood out to you?
Yeah, well, I think the other interesting thing about that story, and a few of these stories, is like the parallels we see. We've talked about parallels with Jesus, but even the parallels between Elijah and Elisha, right? Like this story is very similar when, I think earlier in 1 Kings where Elijah also like helped a widow, right? Not by filling jars with oil, but by keeping a jar full of flour that would feed her and her son. And even the story that happens right after this where Elisha raises her son from the dead, Elijah did that same thing. So again, it's just really clear, like God's saying, the Bible's teaching, like, hey, this role has been passed on. But the other story that I really like, the other miracle, is in chapter 5 with Naaman. Again, Naaman is from Syria. We know he's a rich, wealthy man who has a lot of power. And it even tells us that early in chapter 5 that he had taken, he had gone on raids and he had taken people captive from the land of Israel and brought them back to where he was and basically made them household servants or slaves. And there was a little girl who was in his house. And the other thing we know about Naaman early on is that he has a skin disease, leprosy or something like that. And he tries everything he can to find a cure, but he can't. Nothing he's doing is working. And this little girl, she knows about Elisha, and she goes and tells him there's a man in Israel who can heal you. Which, before we even get to the actual miracle, it's just incredible to think about that for that little girl who has been taken captive and is a slave, yet has, I guess, the forgiveness in her heart and the grace in her life and the compassion for this man who, again, stole her from her home and made her a slave in his house.
Yeah, she should have no reason to want
Right. She should want him to die in a lot of ways, but because of God's grace in her, she tells him there's a way you can be saved. And then we see the actual story where Naaman goes, and it's kind of this process where it seems like God, right, is humbling him step by step. Again, powerful man, a lot of money, a lot of possessions, a lot of power. He goes to the king of Israel and says, hey, here's all my money. I need to be healed. And the king's like, well, hey, I can't do any of that. I can't heal you. The only person who can do it is Elisha. You'll have to go to him. So then he goes to Elisha, and same thing. But Elisha doesn't even come outside. He just says, hey, go to the river and wash 7 times. And Naaman's kind of like, what? What do you mean go to the river and wash 7 times? I could have done that by myself. But it just comes down to, is he willing to humble himself and have faith and obey what God's prophet told him to do? And we see when he does that, God heals him. And so it's this cool story of God, one, humbling this man and bringing him, to a point where he understands his need, not for more money, more power, more wealth, but just he needs the power of God in his life. But the other thing, too, is that he's a Syrian. He's, again, outside of Israel. God bringing in people from the outside, again, foreshadowing what Jesus is going to do by, saying, hey, go and make disciples of all nations. So that story really stood out to me, and that's just a couple of the miracles. Anything else that stood out to you in 1st and 2nd Kings before we kind of wrap up the Old Testament?
Yeah, I think at the end of that story with Naaman, you have his humility that is growing, but at the same time you have this guy that's helping Elisha, who is headed in that other direction. He's basically saying, hey, well, I'll take the money that he was offering you, and kind of just that building up and that, man, I'm going to get for myself. And he is basically inflicted with this leprosy. Not just him, it says you and your descendants forever. It's kind of, again, we've talked about, I feel like, ad nauseum week after week, but it's just the seriousness of sin that God takes it seriously. And so, so that's
just a good lesson about the importance of humility and how pride leads to our downfall if we let it, have a hold in our lives. So, I think that's a good place to finish up the Old Testament.
All right, we're in the New Testament. We started Matthew, another one of the Gospels. We've read a couple of them already, but we're going to start the book of Matthew. And, of course, this book starts with a genealogy, which we've read some genealogies in the Old Testament, but there are some things that are different that we see here. One of the things that stands out to me is, there's a lot of women that are included in this, which in that time is kind of an odd thing. But, again, we see, Jesus is very much, hey, it's for man and woman, but there's also some other things that stand out about the people that he uses in here. What do we see in this listing?
Yeah, I think obviously it's not like the choice is Matthew doesn't really have a choice in who he can include in the genealogy because it's pretty much set in stone. It's where Jesus came from. But it's just interesting to remember as you look through the genealogy, just that this would not necessarily be a genealogy that you would expect to find for Jesus, who is this perfect man, because it's full of a lot of sinful people. Even, again, we've talked about this numerous times. We have heroes of the faith in the Old Testament, but they also, really all of them have their shortcomings. So whether it's, Abraham not sleeping with his wife, but sleeping with a slave instead and trying to kind of go around God's promise, or it's, Jacob the deceiver, or Judah, his son, sleeping with his daughter-in-law. There's all these different examples, right? Even
David's in there.
David with David and Bathsheba. There's plenty. It even says in verse 6, David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife, right? Bathsheba, right? A reminder of what he did by murdering Bathsheba's husband. And so it's kind of, obviously we're seeing the line of Jesus and where he came from, but we're being reminded of all of these characters who were very flawed and sinful individuals. And so whether it's men and women being both in it, or it's just seeing clearly that this is not, a perfect line of people. There's a lot of mistakes and a lot of sin in here, I think are two noteworthy things about this genealogy in chapter 1.
And of course, this genealogy leads up to the birth of Jesus, right? The single most important thing that has happened in mankind, especially this. Literally, it separates the Old from the New Testament. Hey, the Messiah has come and he's here. Anything that stands out to you about this as we kind of...
Yeah, I think we have read Mark and Luke, and now this is Matthew. So we've talked, as we go through this, we're gonna try to cover things that we haven't covered, and we may gloss over some things we have, but specifically with the birth story, with the nativity, the thing that's unique about Matthew is we learn about the wise men and kind of their journey to see Jesus following the star. We see they come to King Herod, who
not pleased,
is not a very good guy, and he's not very pleased. And they end up finding Jesus, and King Herod had told them to basically, after they found Jesus, to come back and tell him, because he told them he wanted to worship Jesus, right? Whenever really he wanted to kill Jesus. And God sends angels in a dream to the wise men, and they don't go back to King Herod. But King Herod finds out that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And, obviously because God's in control, before this happens, Joseph has a dream. And the angel tells him to go to Egypt, to flee to Egypt. And so Mary, Joseph, Jesus flee to Egypt. Well, when King Herod finds out he was born in Bethlehem, he basically orders the massacre of all children under 2. We see it's this horrible picture of evil, this King Herod, right, who sees a threat to his power and is doing the most horrific thing you can think of to minimize or to eliminate that risk or that threat to his power. And so that's kind of the unique, it's not a very uplifting thing, but we see how in God's providence, how he's directing Mary, Joseph, Jesus, even early in his life, to different places to protect him and to make sure that, of course, nothing is going to stop God's plan. So that's kind of the unique facet we see in this nativity story here.
Yeah, so we kind of jump ahead of few decades or so here as we jump from, Herod tries to kill the kids, they have gone to Egypt, then they come back, and then we jump ahead in chapter 3 to John the Baptist preparing the way. And it's actually kind of cool. We talked about Elijah and Elisha, and there's a lot of similarities here, even starting with the way that they dressed. If we look back in 1 Kings, when you have Elijah goes to Elisha and throws his coat on him, has this guy that's dressed in animal hair and a leather belt. And John the Baptist, animal hair and leather belt, eating wild honey and locusts. He's kind of a little out there, but he's the one that will prepare the way, and we see a lot of similarities as we walk through their lives. They both are basically speaking the truth of God's word to people that don't want to hear it. With Elisha, it's the kings. With Elijah, with John the Baptist, Elisha was speaking truth to kings who didn't want to hear it. With I keep going to it, man. John the Baptist, right, speaks to the religious leaders who don't want to hear it, but it says, hey, we're going to speak the truth whether you want to hear it or not.
Even when it's hard. Yeah, right. And we see the cost in all of their lives, right? Like Elijah was on the run. We talked about earlier, despairing for his life because Jezebel's trying to kill him. We know John the Baptist, ends up becoming a martyr, that he's imprisoned and then beheaded. And so, it is, the way these fit together. It worked well this week, where we just see kind of John the Baptist. And even in the New Testament, he's kind of seen as Elijah.
Yeah.
Like they talk about him being kind of this new Elijah who is preparing the way for what Jesus is going to do. And we see that kind of culminate in the baptism of Jesus, where, again, John's like, well, I shouldn't be baptizing you. I'm not worthy to, but Jesus is getting baptized, right? And he says, hey, we need to do this so that it'll be fulfilled, what's been foretold. And so we see the significance of his baptism is that it's kind of ushering in and kind of the beginning of this new ministry that Jesus is about to go public with, which, we could say for us as believers, like our baptism isn't the finish line. It's not, hey, all right, you were saved, you were baptized, and now you just kind of coast the rest of your life. Like our baptism is the beginning, of our journey with Jesus and our own personal ministry to the people that God puts in our lives. And in the same way, we see that here with Jesus and in Matthew.
Yeah, and I think it's a great model too. It's, hey, there's the baptism that obviously he's like submitting to God's will, and then immediately he goes out into this like temptation. We talked about that episode. It was 12, I think we have it on here. So we kind of talked about that a little bit. But in terms of our walk, like we're going to go through those difficulties. And there's hey, Jesus went to God's word. When he like came up against these like temptations, he went to God's word. But again, I think it is so important for us to not baptism's the finish line. It is the beginning of our walk, and we're going to walk through hard times, but Jesus models it for us. And even as we talk about, hey, it's the start of his ministry, we read chapter 5, and we'll get into that a lot more next week as we talk about the Sermon on the Mount as a whole. But that is just a whole, hey, Jesus is about to change everything, the way we view it.
Yeah, and again with this story where whenever Jesus is getting ready to begin his ministry, that's when Satan attacks, right? And in the same way for us, like Satan is totally content for us to be a good church attender and be a pretty good person and just kind of keep our faith to ourselves, right? Like he's fine with that. But like whenever we start obeying God and living out our faith and sharing our faith with others and trying to make disciples like Jesus commanded us to, we will face opposition from dark spiritual forces, just like Jesus did. And so we see Jesus resist that. And then again, we'll talk more about this next week, but we see in chapter 5 him kind of launching publicly his ministry. And we'll see, as we read the rest of the book of Matthew. So we're going to kind of leave chapter 5 for next week because, like you said, it fits into the whole Sermon on the Mount, which is several chapters long. But this kind of sets us up and prepares us for, again, the launch of Jesus' public ministry.
All right, well, it's been great to look at God's Word. Let's have a little bit of fun as well. Not that looking at God's Word is not fun, but just a little stupid fun, if you will. And so, hey, we always like to get to know and let you get to know some people that are part of what happens here at First Arnold. So here is one good minute with someone on our team.
Some weird sauce that my husband brought home from like a weird market. Because I follow sports. I was just talking about this the other day. Probably green beans and ketchup. People pop my bubble gum. Like, I'm blowing a bubble with bubble gum and then they're like, pop. I'm just like, ugh, stop. Pride and Prejudice.
Which one?
Well, Keira Knightley. A Niffler from Harry Potter. The little like moles that go into the ground to dig up gold. I mean, they're just the most adorable things.
Well, thank you for joining us for the Friday Lunchbox. We've had a good time discussing God's Word and hearing one good minute just now. So next week we're going to read from 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. We'll also read the book of Joel and be back in the book of Matthew. We'd encourage you to jump in if you haven't already. If you're behind, just jump up, catch up with us. You can find the reading plan on our website, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have feedback, if you have questions, any way that we can help you or just help you grow in your walk with the Lord. So thanks for joining us. Tom, anything else people need to know?
Yeah, hey, you can also jump on past episodes. Maybe you can go back and look and find those. And one of the questions we've had from people is, does Jeff Rustin really like to party? And remember, he does. So have a great week.